Good.
Oh, every time. How are we doing today? Much better. Okay, lovely. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening on the eve of maybe our largest snowstorm in Montana so far this year. I'm really excited to see you all, as always. My name is Sarah Cawley. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Great Falls Public Library, and I love being able to bring authors and events to the library. We are here to connect people and knowledge. We do that in a variety of different ways, whether it's Armchair Traveler, where we're traveling around the country or the world, or it's author talks bringing history to life for us. So today we have, now I can't jump into that yet. Bathrooms are out in the hallway. There's a water fountain in the hallway, and for emergencies, please take the stairs. That's out the door, to the right, and to the right again. At the end of today's program, we have unlocked the stairs for you guys, so you can take those anyways in case you want to leave faster than the elevator. Your choice on that one. Okay, so thank you all for being here. Tonight's presentation is our wonderful and amazing local historian, Ken, over here. He obviously wrote Hidden History of Great Falls. He also wrote quite a few other books, has come here and talked with the library over and over again. He is one of our beloved authors here, and we are so excited to have him again to share, again, the hidden history of Great Falls. How many folks have grown up in Great Falls? Got a couple. Maybe we'll all walk away and learn something new today, right? That's the whole point of all of this. So let's put on our listening caps and learning caps, right? And let's take a little journey down history lane. So join me in welcoming Ken.
Can you hear me all right? Is the mic up? Good. Sarah, please come up because I'd like to present a copy of the book for the Montana Room.
Perfect. Yay. All right.
So, Great Falls. You know, 4 years ago, the Montana Historical Society closed their research center, and it's been closed, just going to open next week on the 17th of March. And I thought, my gosh, 4 years without being able to do any research there where all the treasures from Montana reside. I thought, you know, maybe that would be a good time to do some histories of Fort Benton and Great Falls, because we have a lot of history in our Overholser Research Center in Fort Benton, and of course the History Museum and various places have a good bit of history in Great Falls. So 2 years ago, Historic Tales of Fort Benton came out. Last year, in fact it was 8 months ago, I was here at the library talking to some of you about Lost Great Falls. And that was a tribute to what we've lost in Great Falls over the years. Obviously, the last chapter had to be the big stack. But as I said then, few cities have ever fostered a greater nostalgia for the past than Great Falls. And part of the reason for that is because by the time this town was 50 or maybe just a little more years old, it was already the largest town in the state. And you know, compared to the mining camps that grew into places like Helena, it was a really Johnny-come-lately town. And one advantage, obviously, was Paris Gibson was able to implement a very well-planned city with east, west, north, south. Go to Helena and try to figure out the streets. But anyway, I talked about the town's dramatic growth and the good times when Great Falls grew dramatically and steadily. And just at age 6 as a town, it had a railroad connecting it to Butte, the beginnings of the Boston and Montana smelter and refinery. the Black Eagle Dam, first dam on the upper Missouri, a silver smelter operating out here from the silver from the mines in the Little Belt Mountains. Then came the big stack and the northern Montana homestead boom. And finally, the military came in during World War II in a very big way. And so what started in 1940 as a good-sized city grew dramatically all the way through the 40s to where by 1950 Butte had faded, Great Falls had climbed, and we were the largest town. So that was our nostalgic tour of what we'd lost in Great Falls. Tonight, I think in a lot of ways is more fun because we're going to be talking about some great adventures and tales that we didn't lose. Some of them forgotten and others perhaps only dimly remembered, but all of them important to Great Falls as a community. So here we go. Hidden history begins with some prehistory. The story of glacial Lake Great Falls. How many books have you read with the story of glacial Lake Great Falls? Missoula's well known. I mean, all you had to do was go through the university, and every day you saw those scars on the side of Sentinel and Jumbo, and you knew glacial Lake Missoula was a monster that grew out of that last series of ice ages. But who knows about Great Falls? Who knows that we have some of the greatest geological features in the country just to the east of here in Lost Lake and Big Sag, and for that matter, the whole Arrow Creek drainage, because that was an interim course of the Missouri River. And glacial Lake Great Falls, they say, you almost, if you jumped to where there were steamboats, you could almost take a steamboat from Cutbank to Glendive. Not quite, there were some gaps in between, but almost. It was that series of lakes, Great Falls and others, were so huge and had such an impact. And of course, changed the course of the Missouri River from flowing north toward the Hudson Bay to where it flows today. And then we're going to be moving on to a battle, not tonight, but in the book, between Blackfoot warriors and about 80 trappers with Jim Bridger that were fought right here on the site of Great Falls. Then we'll board a steamboat in Broadwater Bay, and we'll go on up to Gates of the Mountain. We might go all the way to Townsend because they did. And I don't mean steamboats in Fort Benton, I mean steamboats right here in Great Falls. Now, they were half-size steamboats, but at the time in the 1890s when these were running, Fort Benton steamboats were half-size steamboats also at the time. So some pretty remarkable things that we just, where can you read about it? Well, you can read it. We'll join Vinegar Jones, that colorful cousin of Paris Gibson, who didn't always get along with him. And he did a couple of things that are very memorable and they're included in the book. One is he campaigned tirelessly to get the county commission to put signs up to mark the Mullen Road because he was concerned about the Mullen Military Wagon Road that had extended from Fort Benton on the upper Missouri to Fort Walla Walla at the head of navigation on the Columbia. And memories of that was fading, and Vinegar berated the county commission for about 20 years. He, after a number of years, he gave up on the county commission and went out and put his own signs up They were orange and green signs that said Mullen Road. And they went from west of here over Burtail Divide. And you know, Mullen Road goes on then down to the Dearborn. So the other thing that our beloved Vinegar Jones did, you see in Gibson Park whenever you go there now, because we had to move it because it's going to be demolished on 5th Avenue South. And that's the cabin, the little 20 by 14-foot cabin that's there in Gibson Park. He didn't build it, but he bought it a few years after another Fort Benton carpenter had built it, and he moved it across the street, lived in it for quite a number of years before he moved another house, a two-story that he had built also, onto the same lot. So bless Vinegar for saving that cabin and for his work to commemorate the Mullen Road. We're going to meet a brilliant miner who brought Butte copper to Great Falls and set the stage for that amazing Montana copper story that I told briefly in Lost Great Falls about copper mined in Butte, smelted in Anaconda, refined in Great Falls. And that copper from the 1890s on literally lit the world. That copper wire came out of Great Falls. It didn't come out of Butte. And when Butte tells the entire copper story, that's bogus. It's Butte, Anaconda, and Great Falls to make that great nationally important copper story, not only to wire the world, but for munitions during the world wars, both of the wars. And I bring up the copper story in this because this has the story of, how many of you know the name Thomas Couch? Thanks. Thomas Couch we should all bless, because he's the one, when he was heading Boston and Montana and Butte, that brought the company to Great Falls, Montana. And Thomas Couch's story is in here. Thomas Couch is also, I think, kind of important because he's the guy that's the grandfather of one of the great women I've got in the book, and that's Sue Ford Bovey. There wouldn't have been a Sue Ford Bovey. In fact, there wouldn't have been the mother of Sue Ford Bovey if it hadn't been for Thomas Couch. So he's on the good guy list for a number of reasons. Hidden history also takes us into, you know, back in the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, people were saying, when I was trying to get interest going, they were saying, well, we didn't have any big battles here, or it meant nothing to Montana. That was nonsense. So, of course, some of you probably had to endure my monthly articles, the short ones in the Great Falls Tribune and the long ones in the River Press. I did that for the whole course of the war. And then I took some of those and added some more to form Montana Territory in the Civil War, my first of a trilogy. Well, that's all in the past, but in Hidden History Montana, there's a really cool story, because I don't know how many of you know that Great Falls has the very first monument or tribute in the nation that combines the North and the South, the Yankees and the Rebels, on a single monument. That soldier's monument with the cannon on top that has the plaques on the side that say, for the boys in gray and the boys in blue and so on. They went through a newspaper battle back in the decade or so after that was put in place in the early 1900s about whether that really was the first in the nation. And they reached agreement it was. Pretty important. And who knew? Let's sail on to the Lower South Side. Now, the Lower South Side was the origins of Great Falls. several years before the Townside Company decided to open things up to the higher priced houses on the north side, the south side was booming, and it was multi-ethnic. It had in fact, the African Americans in our midst were restricted to the lower south side. There was no city ordinance, but only one actually ever lived in that, outside that lower south side until, let's say, well into the 60s and so on. So, south side, I have a chapter in here on the south side African American accomplishments in the 1890s, some pretty remarkable things. The first black elected to public office in Montana, to my knowledge, and nobody's challenged me on it, is from the lower south side and so on. And then there's one of the great, this is Women's History Month, and it couldn't be better for Martha Edgerton Rolfe. She later added the name Plasman when she had to remarry because her dear Herbert Rolfe died of typhoid fever here in Great Falls in 1895 when he was just 45 years old. Left Mattie, as we call her, left Mattie with 7 young children. She homeschooled to some extent. It was a mix. She took over daily editing of his newspaper, the Leader, the Evening Leader, and for 18 months she hands-on edited to the extent where the Anaconda Standard paid tribute that she not only edited, but she had improved it over the time she'd had it. Pretty fine tribute from the most powerful newspaper in the state at the time. And Mattie's in here for 2 reasons. I've got 2 stories of hers. One is a story that Great Falls and Helena share because they led the state in the 1890s that centered on a legislature in the mid-1890s that almost got women's suffrage passed and finally was blocked by one damn committee chairman. But Mattie was the leader here in Great Falls, and so I have the story, and I also have her original letter the day that she voted in 1916 and what she had to say about giving her first vote. It's a remarkable letter. Mattie was also inducted into the Blackfeet Nation, and the story of that is in here as well. And then there's our little Joe Howard, who, as a 17-year-old, graduated from Great Falls High School, and a couple weeks later walked in the door of the Leader and went to work, age 17. Within 3 years, he was a copy editor of the paper. He selected the stories, he wrote those dazzling headlines that the kids would hawk on the streets, and he essentially was day-to-day running the paper at age 20. And we remember him as Joseph Kinsey Howard for Montana High, White, and Hanson, but he did a lot of other things en route that. And then there's Charlie, then there's our Silver Spoon kids, Charlie and Sue Ford Bovey, who managed to bring Montana into a preservation age a couple decades before preservation was cool. And they started here, some of you old timers probably will remember Old Town at the fairgrounds from 1941 to 1961. So essentially 20 years, you could go into the Trades and Industry building and find an entire block as if it were an old town from the 1880s or 70s. Pretty exciting. It had Joe Sullivan's saddlery from Fort Benton and so on. Well, in 1961, our wonderful county commissioners had a mental freeze and asked Charles Bovee to remove Old Town from the fairgrounds. Now, it wasn't just open for the week or 10 days or whatever it is the fair was going on. It was open year-round, and in the years that it operated, it had, I've heard estimates as much as 500,000 people, because it was open year-round. And it was a trailblazing operation and he started some things like the Old Town Promoter, that was a newspaper, and he roped in Fort Benton people like Joel Overholtzer. I have Joel Overholtzer's, the invitation that Bovee sent to Joel to join as a board member of what was called the Landmark Society. And then there's, I guess I better get going because I want to do some reading, and I'm gonna take all the time just talking. But then there's two other things, and those are the two things we'll talk about tonight. One is what I call reservationless, although they always went by landless Indians, reservationless Native Americans that were on the fringes of Great Falls society for really the entire history of the town. By 1890, the first small group had congregated on the west bank. Of course, there was no west side at that point, although some things were beginning to grow up there, like the Great Falls to Lethbridge Turkey Trail Railroad, the narrow gauge railroad that I wrote about in Lost Great Falls. But anyway, they started on the West Bank, and I'll talk about that. And then finally, there's a pretty magnificent lady by the name of Josephine Trigg, and I thought it was especially appropriate here in the Great Falls Public Library to talk about Josie. And I will do a little of that. Her story is remarkable in a number of ways, and it's in the book. But the most remarkable thing, of course, is the fact that we might not have Charlie Russell Auction Week next week. We might not have the big museum that we have here today if it hadn't been for Josie Trigg. So, onward. If I remember how to do this. Uh-oh. What did I do? Didn't go to sleep?
Keep going.
Anyway, it's supposed to show the first library, which of course was the Valeria Library. It used to be where Library Park is today. There it is, and there's old Robert Williams, who was an extremely well-educated botanist who happened to be the first librarian. And actually, the Valeria was more of a arts and culture center than it was a library in the early years, but it served a tiny little library, served a tiny little town until it grew into the much bigger town by 1900, and then it was just too small. And that's when the Carnegie Library came, I think in 1903. And Josie Trigg, this is where she worked. So let me read from the book. I've got it on the sheet here because I read better in dark script here than in the light script there. The chapter is Miss Josephine Trigg, a fine and gracious lady's powerful tribute to Charles M. Russell. Emma Josephine Trigg was the catalyst for the creation of one of the first museums in the United States dedicated to Western art, originally the Trigg-Russell Memorial Gallery. Trigg's remarkable success was especially noteworthy coming only about a decade after the city of Great Falls had lost And I covered that in the Lost Great Falls. I lost the priceless mint and silver dollar collections of Russell art. Among the great losses that I do talk about in Lost Great Falls. Since its modest opening in 1953 to present the Trigg collection of Western art, of Russell art, the tiny gallery has transformed into the world-renowned C.M. Russell Museum, one of the premier art museums in the United States. The museum is co-located with the Charles M. Russell home, where Charlie and Nancy Cooper Russell lived, and the original log cabin studio where the cowboy artist created most of his masterpieces. The Russell home, log cabin studio were designated a National Historic Landmark in 1965. This is Emma Josephine Trigg's remarkable story. First graduating class. Emma Josephine was born Albert J. and Margaret Trigg in Bronson, Michigan in August of 1871. A.J. Trigg arrived in Great Falls in the spring of 1888, so she was about 17 years old when she arrived, because she came shortly after. Just 4 years after Great Falls' founding, and by mid-June, he'd opened the Brunswick, an elegant saloon equipped with pool and billiard tables in the Collins Block. In late September, Margaret and teenage Josephine joined in, and the family quickly became active participants in the social scene of the rising little city. In November, Josephine played the role of Hannah Blinky Peak in the musical comedy Peak Sisters from Alaska. Of course, this was during the Alaska Gold Rush period. At Minot Hall, on the following spring, she attended the grand ball as the town's new businessman's Rainbow Club made its debut. Josie Trigg was a welcome addition to the first class to attend Great Falls High School. This class of 4 was honored as they graduated on June 8, 1893. And at the Opera House, another place we lost, the first annual commencement of Great Falls High School drew a large crowd. There were some proud and happy mothers and fathers who looked on approvingly, besides a great many friends and patrons of the public schools at the Opera House last night. All were there to witness the finishing touches to the school life of 4 bright young ladies. The graduates were Miss Josie Trigg, Miss Maud McNeil, Miss Lulu Armstrong, and Miss Gertrude Anderson. The class, though small, exemplifies to a large extent what's being done in an educational way in our city, and the showing is both credible to people and teachers. Miss Josephine Trigg presented an essay entitled Out of School Life into Life's School. There was not a dull line in this paper. It was clear and concise and showed that the young ladies possessed of good sound judgment and a firm grasp of the duties and obligations incident to mature life. A.J. Trigg and Charlie Russell became friends. While Josie was in high school, her father became friends with a charming young cowboy who came in from the range to spend part of the winter of 1891-92 batching at the Red Onion Transit Shack on the south side, while socializing, drinking, and painting at Trigg's Brunswick Saloon. Charlie Russell survived that winter by selling an occasional painting through A.J. Trigg, the beginnings of their warm friendship. And so a year later, a year after Josie graduated, the school trustees met at Corey Block. Principal Largent reported that many new scholars were being admitted daily to the public schools, which were now in a very crowded state, forcing half-day classes. Sound familiar from a few years ago? The teachers committee recommended Josie Trigg, this is 1 year after high school, as teacher of music, and the nomination was unanimously confirmed. This began Miss Trigg's leading role in music and art in Great Falls Public Schools. During that summer, she spent 2 months in St. Paul visiting friends and taking a course in art. So, I'm going to move on here. There are people in that picture. And that picture's taken at the Dearborn. So, this was Josephine. This is jumping ahead a little. Josephine and her husband, William T. Ridgely, along with Nancy and Charlie. They, of course, are the two in front. And somewhere I've got the yeah, this photo was taken in 1898 at a camping party on the Dearborn. Seated in the foreground are Nancy and Charlie, and then to the right in the uniform of Shattuck Military School is Henry Webster. Others from left to right are Frank Webster, Judge S.S. Hawkins, Theo Lefevre, Margaret Trigg, of course Josie's mother, Mrs. Hawkins, and the cook, old Jess Smith. And apparently they didn't know one or two in the back. Over the next 5 years, Miss Trigg led the schools in music and at times art, while remaining very active in Great Falls society. Great Falls was booming during the 1890s, and one very eligible bachelor was William T. Ridgely, an accomplished lawn tennis player and bicyclist. William Timothy Ridgely was born in October 1871 in Mohican, Ashland County, Ohio, to John and Emma Ridgely. Young Will Ridgely had arrived in Great Falls by December 2nd, 1890, and that evening he joined other bachelors in hosting a social dance at the Hotel Brink. Josie Trigg attended that dance that evening, and dancing continued until 1 in the morning with Home Sweet Home as the last waltz. Josie and Will certainly met for the first time that evening. Will Ridgely came to Great Falls to work for H.E. Sweat, who also of Ashland, Oregon, who had moved to the new city in the fall of 1890 to manage the industrial printing company. Based on his extensive travel in the coming years, Ridgely was a man of some means. He became an active participant in the social scene, and in 1891 returned to his home in Ashland. This is the first of a number of visits that he made back to Ohio, one of which he combined in 1893 with attending the Chicago World's Fair. So Will Ridgely came with some money. Miss Trigg and Mr. Ridgely were together often at social events, and in August 1895, several others plus Ridgely and Bruce, two men with Josephine, had a 3-day outing on Logging Creek. We don't have a photo of that outing, but this is a couple of years later after they were married on Dearborn. The year 1897 set the stage for dramatic change in the lives and futures of Charles M. Russell, the Trigg family, and Will Ridgely. Russell married Nancy Cooper on September 9th, 1896 in nearby Cascade. The following summer, the newlyweds moved to Great Falls to gain a larger market for Charlie's art. The previous acquaintance of A.J. Trigg and Russell soon blossomed into a very close friendship between the Triggs and the Russells, and broadened to include Will and Josie Ridgely. Meanwhile, Ridgely's role in publishing the works of the cowboy artist blossomed and grew rapidly as the leader emphasized in a story. Russell's fame is Ridgely's. As the fame of Charles M. Russell, the cowboy artist of the West, is gradually spreading all over this broad land, so the reputation of W.T. Ridgely's company. As the exponents by then, Ridgely had taken over the publishing company. A picture of Russell's on a calendar or a business card with a little artistic printing by the Ridgely Company thereon finds for it a ready sale anywhere. And it's only a matter of time before the already liberal proportions of the plant will have to be enlarged to accommodate the growing demand for Russell's work. And that continued. And I will just emphasize that there's a lot of detail that I found about that relationship that led to publication of things like pencil sketches and so on. But I've got to leap forward to a period of problems. First of all, Josie and Will had married, but then there were some tragedies. They lost a child, a baby actually, right after it was born. Then they separated, and then they divorced. And so Josie was back in the workforce, and she joined the Great Falls Public Library at about the very time that one of the early children's room was being set up, and it was on the lower level of the Carnegie Library. So Miss Josephine and her children's room, and she became legendary for decades as the children's librarian. She was honored throughout the city for the great work she did with children. And we don't have time to dwell on that, but let me leap forward to what I think seals Josie's place in history, and that is Miss Trigg passes on but leaves a vital legacy. On New Year's Day, 1951, Miss Josephine Trigg died. Her only surviving relatives were a cousin, Paul Trigg, in Great Falls, and cousins in the Midwest. Her will left her family's large Charlie Russell collection, estimated at the time to be worth $50,000. But if you look at it today, every one of those illustrated letters, maybe $100,000 a letter or something up to that. So, I mean, it's an immensely important collection, but it was especially important because the provisions of her will said that to any corporation which may be formed to perpetuate the name of the Montana cowboy, giving first preference to Great Falls. Of course, the big question was, would Great Falls meet the challenge? They just blew it on the mint collection, and the big loss there. Well, they did, and within the 3-year stipulated time frame, this tiny Trigg Russell Memorial Gallery opened, and there we are today. And I'm going to have to leap quickly forward to the other thing that I really wanted to couple with this, and that's, of course, we had earlier in Lost Great Falls had the story of the Turkey Trail, and in 1896, when Lieutenant John Pershing and his Black 10th Cavalry came to Great Falls and the other towns in Montana and rounded the Cree up. Now, these were Cree refugees from the time in 1885 in the Red River Valley of Canada that the Métis and Cree had rebelled. They called it a resistance. It was a little more than that. It was a downright war for a number of months. And in refuge, hundreds of those Cree and Métis had crossed the border to take sanctuary in Montana. So here it is a decade later, and the U.S. Congress has passed legislation to evict the Cree from the U.S., many of them being in Montana. And so Lieutenant John J. Pershing, who of course went on to fame as the American Expeditionary Force leader in World War I in Europe, led the 10th Cavalry in rounding up, and some 500 Cree were boarded on the Turkey Trail railway here and sent back to Canada, as several, including, several have noted that within some months, most had returned to the United States and were hiding in valleys in different places or in the outskirts of Great Falls. So with that, let me read just briefly. I don't have very much time. I can't do justice to this, but this is the Landwood Indians on the Fringe. Great Falls is no good place, is a quote from one of them. In the time of Charlie Russell's painting, when the land belonged to God, the Blackfoot ruled the land that became Great Falls. Yet by the birth of the town in the spring of 1884, the Piikani Blackfeet were restricted to the reservation, while the Kainai, Siksika, and Piikani were north of the Medicine Line on their reserves in the Northwest Territory of Canada. Only landless Indians freely roamed Montana, and that included the Métis. The roots of Montana's landless Indians were the exiled Canadians and Canadian Cree and Métis. The same spring that Great Falls began to build, the brilliant, mystical Métis leader, Louis Riel, was teaching at nearby St. Peter's Mission. You know, that's not too far to the southwest of here, and we have 4 new interpretive signs that tell the story of the complex as well as Louis Riel in place out there. Just went in a few weeks ago. The Northwest Resistance of 1885 followed and failed, and in its aftermath, Riel was tried and hanged. Hundreds of his Métis followers and their allied Cree, led by Chief Big Bear's son, Little Bear, fled across the Medicine Line into Montana exile. Many settled along Spring Creek as Lewistown began, or along the South Fork of the Teton west of today's Choteau on the Rocky Mountain front. Other Cree remained unsettled, moving from town to town on the fringes of society. Meanwhile, the Turtle Mountain Little Shell, the non-reservation Chippewa, roamed Montana. A 1964 study, Our Indian Neighbors by Andre Deglish and Nicholas Roman's later brilliant account in that book that is being reprinted right now by the Montana Historical Society. That's Nicholas Roman's book, The Whole Country Was One Robe, the Little Shell Tribes, America. They both tell the complex story of the Chippewa families under Chief Little Shell that migrated west into Montana from the Turtle Mountains of Dakota Territory. With the passing of the Buffalo, Little Shell's Chippewa, as well as Chief Rocky Boy's Chippewa, lived in marginal conditions near Montana's town, seeking food, jobs, and a place to live. With the arrival of the railroad at Great Falls in 1887, that's the Great Northern, the little town underwent rapid growth, and by 1890, landless natives had settled in an encampment along the west bank of the Missouri opposite Great Falls. Among the Cree present in May of 1890 were Black Eagle, White Wolf, and Half Moon, all together with a small child roaming Great Falls streets with polished buffalo horns and trying to raise a little money. And Half Moon, who spoke some English, said, "The glory of the Indian is departed. No more he wanders by the broad Minnesota, Missouri, in quest of game. The buffalo is gone, the antelope nearly gone, the iron horse has come, and the pale faces have followed in its trail. The hunting grounds of the Indians are full of cattle, but he owns none. The great father at Washington promises good things to the red man, but he waits and waits for them all the time. This is a nice pair of buffalo horns, only $3. The West Bank Landless Indian Camp, from the early 1890s onward, the main landless camp was on the West Bank, most of the time kind of opposite what was originally Squaw Island, but is now, of course, Sacagawea Island, sort of on the northwest side of the bend in the Missouri. And I don't have time to do very much, but I do want to introduce the two angels that I write about in the book, because from the beginning, the camps on the West Bank were pretty much on their own, but there was a time, after years of marginal assistance to the landless Indian camp, that's the West Bank camp, in 1923, the Family Welfare Association was formed by the Cascade County to carry on through one organization work previously done by a combination of the Red Cross, Salvation Army, and some other groups. Since funds were scarce, the director selected Miss Harriet Carrier as executive secretary to lead the Family Welfare Association, while she continued her previous role as secretary of the Red Cross. So no cost for this new role that she was playing, which was to try to bring some assistance to those landless Native Americans. For the next decade, Harriet Carrier worked tirelessly and effectively on behalf of the local landless Indians with limited funds. And I've got quite a little about the camps, the conditions, and the help that Harriet Carrier was able to bring. But I'll move quickly on to, well, first of all, this is the West Bank. That's Sacagawea Island, so this is part of the trail on the West Bank, and that's the only photo I could find of Harriet. So let me jump forward to the spring of 1931. So this is after the 20s on the West Bank. In the spring of 1931, many residents of nearby Black Eagle protested the presence of the Indian camp as an intolerable and insufferable nuisance. From May 22nd to 25th, the Indian camp was forced to relocate while the old shacks were burned. According to Andre Dalglish, the families took refuge on Hill 57 because a woman of Indian descent offered them land there on which to build shacks. At that time, a survey showed there were about 50 Indian families, and the number varies so much because seasonally, in the summer, so many were out on ranches or farms trying to eke out a hired hand living, and then they'd come back in the fall and spend the winter first on West Bank and then on Hill 57. And it was a marginal life. You all, especially you old timers here in Great Falls, know much about Sister Providencia, the second of my angels, and the great effort she had, and she was particularly effective in getting the message to the congressional delegation and getting action in Washington, where of course, earlier that nothing was happening except on the local scene. And of course, the big fight was always over, say, the Cascade County would claim, well, these are Indians, they should be under the Indian Bureau or the Department of Indian Affairs, or whatever it was called at the time. And of course, the Washington bureaucracy would say, well, they're not reservation Indians, they're not our responsibility. And so efforts on the part of Providencia and the congressional delegations in the 40s and 50s began to turn that around to a much better situation today. And with that, I have to leap forward because I have a special treat for you this evening. Brian Morger, who's Great Falls. You know, if you want to capture Great Falls history, just look at you can tell us, Brian, how many, but the many paintings that Brian has done of historic buildings, including buildings lost like the Opera House. So, Brian, please come and give us some thoughts about Josephine Trigg and her art collection, and anything else you'd like to say.
Okay. Well, always a pleasure being invited to the Cordonling Room at the library to be with Ken. And so he asked me if I would somehow segue into maybe a little story with his book and his talk tonight. So I thought this is a print of mine called Evening at the Russells that I did, I guess, oh my gosh, 1988. And you can see that it's got Russell's log cabin studio. Now the house, ironically, was moved away from the log cabin studio at one point because they were afraid the house would catch on fire and burn the log studio down, which was so valuable. And now the house sits where it's at, is a visitor draw. But this house here, that's the tree home. And you can see in proximity to the Russell's home and the space between, there was a lot between, that there was a path to coming over for dinner on many winter nights. And I don't even know what book it was in, but I would read about some of these dinner visits that Nancy and Charlie, you can see, okay, this is probably depicted about, the house was built in 1900, 1902. And of course, this is 4th Avenue North, which was the primo street in Great Falls to locate on. Can you imagine a log cabin being built there? Well, but this was Charlie Russell, and it was built by the proceeds of his mother's. He inherited. A lot of people say, well, he just divorced. No, about that time, he inherited quite a bit of money from his mother, and they were able to locate on the finest street in Great Falls. And about this time, if it was, what year was the divorce of 1912, I think, from Ridgely? Okay. 12 is a good. So, Josephine she returned to her name Trigg, and I think that she lived there with her parents then, and so it was the three of them. And Albert Trigg was a judge by then, probably a municipal judge, and he passed away in 1917, about 10 years before Charlie. So, say this is 1920. I'll bet that it was Josephine and Margaret and Charlie and Nancy having dinner there. And Charlie would often say, you know, can I draw something or paint something? And very often he would sketch or watercolor something right at the table that in gratitude for the fine dinner I'm sure was served. Now, The past informs the now, and I would say that in a way, I'm standing before you, and in many ways, Josephine Trigg had a part in my coming to be as an artist, my portrayal of Great Falls as an artist. I grew up in Fort Benton. Although I was born here in Great Falls, I grew up one of 9 children, and my family would come to Great Falls, of course, in the station wagon, and we were baby boomers, so we're talking the late 60s, early 70s, and I didn't want to do some of the regular stuff that families did, shopping, and especially material stores. I had 6 sisters, and they went to material stores to get patterns and bolts of fabric and buttons to make clothes and zippers. And today, I can't go into a material store, I'm sorry. And I would go in and I would be this wet noodle, and I would lay around, and so they would drop me off at the Russell Museum, which wasn't the C.M. Russell Museum until 1971. Before that, it was the Joseph Trigg Collection Museum. And at that time, in the early 70s, and here I am, I'm a 10, 12-year-old kid, and the family would drop me off and give me the 75 cents, I think it was, for a kid under 12, maybe it was even free. And I would go in there, and the docent always knew this kid would come in usually on a Saturday, and I would spend all afternoon in there, and then often they would close, and I would go out onto the boulevard and wait for the station wagon to show up, and crawl in. But I studied Russell's work. I was fascinated with them, and they wondered with this kid if he was going to vandalize. Why was he here? Why would his parents drop him off at a museum? And I would get real close when the docent wasn't looking, and I would touch the paint. and it would, and I've never had a formal lesson, and I'd like to say that I dissected Russell's work. I kind of saw how he worked, and I was able to then do my own. And I was 13 years old, and I did. I couldn't even brought it, and I found it not too long ago. And it was 3 Indian horsemen, one with a lance, and the Highwood Mountains behind. And I did it up in my bedroom when I brought it down to show the family at dinner time. And my mother said, "You didn't do that." So, again, the past informs the now. Josephine had the children's room here, and it was quite she loved decorating it, and it was a destination for kids in those days. And at some point, Charlie said, he loved Christmas. He said it needs a Santa Claus. And he painted a miniature sleigh and a little miniature man, jolly old elf. Not your Coca-Cola Santa Claus. I think he even had a blue outfit on and his whip. And there's the reindeer, all in every different position. And it hung in the children's room for many years. And I think the original is now, of course, it became part of the Trigg collection. And it used to hang in the museum then when I would visit. And I started doing Christmassy things because of that painting. I thought I love that depiction of Santa Claus. I wasn't so big on the Coca-Cola Santa Claus, but I loved that jolly elf. So anyway, my connection to Josephine and her collection, and thank you very much.
So when it got to selecting a cover for Lost Great Falls, when the last chapter was the big stack, Brian's painting was the natural. we got permission from the owners, and it's on the cover. Great painting.
I've done some sketches. These are free to go along with the book tonight. So did them while I was sitting here. Okay. So first
Brian
of all,
follows his way, his time away very nicely, doesn't he? I'll be at the Cassiopeia later this month, and the next, this day after tomorrow is second Saturday of March, and Brenda Waller, who's in the center here, and she's going to be at the History Museum and talking about a very important guy also, and that it's actually the second book that she's done on Marcus Daly. His story is so big that it couldn't be done in one volume, so this is a lot of the Montana years and the powerful copper king that he became in Montana. And Brenda will be talking at 1 o'clock at the History Museum, and then in April I'll be talking about my favorites, Charles and Sue Ford Moby, and I'll probably couple it with the steamboat tales, because I think we need to talk more about the fact Great Falls actually had a little steamboat period. It wasn't many decades, but it was about a decade. So with that, I'll be very happy to sign copies, and Sierra will take your money, and thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, so much for coming out. As always, we appreciate you. Thank you, Ken, for that talk. There are always things happening here in the library. You can guarantee on Tuesdays and Thursdays we will have programming here in the evening for adults. Next week it's 2 more authors. Yay! So we have Maya Jewel Zeller on Tuesday. She is going to be coming to talk about Raised by Ferns. That's her latest book, with special guest Jamie Ford will also be there. He's gonna lead the conversation. That's great. And then on Thursday of next week for the Stories from the River series, we have local author Pete Fromm coming out for that one. So that one's gonna be great. And just as a shout out, we do have Brenda scheduled as well in May. So, like I said, just put us on your calendar every Tuesday, Thursday.
And May will be different talks than the one I'm doing on Saturday.
And May will be different than the one that's on Saturday. Love that. Good information. All right. Well, thank you all so much again for coming out, and we'll see you next time.
I'm just